She arrived at the engagement dinner in a second-hand dress. No jewelry, no designer bag. The billionaire's family laughed, quietly, but she heard every word. What none of them knew was sitting in a sealed envelope inside her purse. And by the end of that night, everything flipped. I want you to stay with me through this entire story, because this isn't just about money or revenge or some dramatic twist. This is about what happens when people decide your worth before you ever open your mouth. This is about the quiet ones, the ones who never feel the need to prove themselves until the moment comes when the truth does it for them. If you've ever walked into a room and felt invisible, if you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this one don't come around often. Now let's begin. I grew up in a town so small that everyone knew your name, your parents' names, and exactly what your family had for dinner on Sundays. My father was a school teacher, the kind of man who wore the same 3 shirts on rotation and still managed to look dignified in all of them. My mother ran a tailoring shop from the front room of our house, and the smell of pressed cotton and thread was the smell of my entire childhood. We were not poor, but we were not wealthy either. We were the kind of family that had enough to eat, enough to laugh, enough to feel like the world was mostly good. I never chased status. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because later in this story, some people will assume I had a plan, that I was playing some kind of long game. I wasn't. I was just living my life the way my father taught me, quietly, honestly, and without needing the approval of people who didn't know me. I was 28 when I met Nicholas, and the first thing I need to tell you about that meeting is that it happened in mud, real mud, the kind that gets into your shoes and stays there for a week. There had been severe flooding in a rural district about 2 hours from the city, and a community volunteer organization I'd been part of for 3 years was sending teams out to help with cleanup and supply distribution. I showed up with my old rain boots and a bag full of canned goods, and Nicholas showed up the same way. No entourage, no cameras, just a tall man in muddy boots who kept making quiet jokes to ease the tension of the work. I didn't know his last name for 3 months. He introduced himself simply as Nicholas, and I had no reason to look any further. We worked side by side that weekend, and then the next, and somewhere in between the supply runs and the exhausted conversations over cold instant coffee, something grew between us. He was thoughtful. He listened, really listened, in a way that felt rare. He asked about my father's teaching, about my mother's tailoring work, about the town I grew up in. He never made me feel small for any of it. It was only when a colleague of mine showed me a photograph on her phone, a financial magazine cover, that I realized who I had been spending my Saturdays with. Nicholas came from one of the most established families in the country. His family had built their fortune over 3 generations through land development, large-scale farming infrastructure, and commodity trading. They were not just wealthy, they were the kind of wealthy that comes with lawyers, gatekeepers, and a very specific idea of who belonged in their world. I remember sitting in my car after my colleague showed me that photograph, and I just sat there for a very long time, because now everything had the potential to become complicated, and I was right. When Nicholas told his family he was getting engaged, I was not in the room, but I heard about the reaction in pieces, through Nicholas, through his hesitation on the phone that night, through the pauses in his voice that spoke louder than his words. His mother, Victoria, was a woman who had spent decades carefully managing the family's image and its alliances. She had opinions about everything, architecture, bloodlines, and apparently about me. The engagement dinner was scheduled for a Thursday evening. Nicholas told me it was a casual family welcome, a chance for everyone to meet, relax, and get to know each other. He said the word casual. I want you to remember that, because casual and what I walked into were 2 different universes. Nobody told me it was being held in one of the most expensive private dining rooms in the city's oldest luxury hotel. Nobody told me there would be 12 family members present, plus the family's legal advisor. Nobody told me there was a dress code. Looking back now, I understand that the omission was not an accident. My mother had sewn me a dress for the occasion, a beautiful, simple blue dress with careful stitching along the collar. She'd made it with love, the way she made everything. I wore it with small white shoes I'd had for 2 years and no jewelry beyond a thin bracelet my father had given me the year before he passed. I walked into that hotel lobby and I knew immediately. I could feel it in the air, the way you feel a change in weather. Something cold was coming. Victoria was seated at the head of the table when I arrived. She looked me up and down in the span of 1 second, and something shifted in her expression. Not shock exactly, but a kind of quiet confirmation, as if I had just proven something she had already decided. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The cousins whispered. I caught pieces of it. The words second hand and where did he find her drifting toward me under the cover of clinking glasses. One of Nicholas's aunts made a point of mentioning her own dress within the first 5 minutes, naming the designer twice, watching my face for a reaction. I gave her nothing. I smiled politely and complimented the restaurant instead. Then came the questions. They started subtle, and then they became something less than subtle. Where did I study? What field was I in? What did my father do for work? Did I own property? Did I understand estate management? The family's legal advisor, a sharp-faced man who clearly felt this was part of his job description, leaned forward at one point and asked me, in a voice just loud enough for the table to hear, whether I had ever consulted a financial planner. The implication underneath the question was not hidden. He wanted to know what I was after. He wanted to know if I was a threat or just a mistake. I answered every question, calmly, honestly. My father was a school teacher, yes. I worked in agricultural land research. I had studied at a public university. I did not own a penthouse. I did not summer anywhere. And with each answer, I watched the table make its judgment in real time, watched them file me away in a category labeled harmless but unsuitable. But the moment that stayed with me, the one I still think about, was not something Victoria said or the lawyer implied. It was Nicholas. I looked at him at one point, in the middle of a particularly pointed exchange, and I watched him look away. Not at me, away from me, down at his plate, and in that moment I felt something close to alone that I hadn't felt since the night my father died. I touched the envelope in my purse once, just once. My fingers found it under the fabric, and I made a decision. Not tonight. This was not the right night. I put my hand back on the table, finished my meal, and thanked Victoria for having me, and left. I drove home slowly. There was no dramatic music in my head, just the sound of the road, the heater running, and the quiet weight of the evening sitting in my chest. My apartment was small and clean, and exactly what I needed. I sat at my kitchen table, poured myself a glass of water, and looked at my father's photograph on the shelf. He was smiling in it, that particular smile of his that made you feel like everything would eventually make sense. I talked to him that night. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth, and this is a true story. I told him about the dress, about the questions, about the lawyer's face, and then I told him something I hadn't said out loud in a long time. I told him that I was tired of carrying something so heavy in secret. Here is what you need to know about my father. To the town we grew up in, to every student he ever taught, to every parent who came to him for advice, he was simply Mr. Elias, the school teacher with the worn shirts and the endless patience. That was who he chose to be. But before I was born, before he met my mother, before he ever set foot in a classroom, he was someone else entirely. My father was the silent co-founding partner of what became one of the largest agricultural supply and landholding companies in the region. He and his business partner built it from almost nothing, 20 years of strategy, sacrifice, and vision. And then, when it was beginning to reach its full size, his business partner betrayed him, forged documents, pushed him to the margins. My father could have fought it in court for decades.
Instead, he took what was legally uncontestable, a 34% ownership stake in the company locked into a trust, and he walked away. He chose peace. He chose a quiet life, a small town, a woman who made dresses, and a classroom of children who needed someone to believe in them.
He never talked about the money, not once. He used his portion of the dividends carefully and quietly, for our home, for my education, for savings he never touched. He believed that wealth without character was just noise, and he wanted me to grow up understanding the difference between being valued and being priced. When he passed, I inherited everything. Not just the house, not just the savings, but the full 34% stake in a company that had grown in the decades since his departure into something staggering. Agricultural infrastructure, land leases, commodity holdings, export contracts, the kind of asset sheet that makes serious lawyers sit down before they read it. I was, on paper, worth considerably more than Nicholas's entire family combined. I had known this for 2 years. I had told no one, not my close friends, not my colleagues, and not, until a very specific evening, Nicholas himself. People always ask me why. Why keep it hidden? Why not simply tell the truth? And my answer is always the same. I grew up watching my father be the most respected man in our town, with nothing but his dignity and his mind. I wanted to know, I genuinely needed to know, whether the person who said he loved me loved the woman who showed up in muddy boots to flood relief sites, not the woman on the asset sheet. The night after that dinner, I called Nicholas. I told him to come over. And when he sat down across from me at that small kitchen table, I opened the envelope and I put the documents in front of him. I didn't explain them first. I let him read. I watched his face change. I watched understanding arrive like a slow tide. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looks like shame coming up from somewhere deep. He put the papers down. He didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said, quietly, that he was sorry. Not for the family, for himself, for looking away at that table when he should have looked at me. That apology mattered, not because it fixed everything, but because it was real. I could tell the difference. Victoria, it turned out, could not let it rest. In the weeks that followed, she hired a private investigator, a decision she made, I later learned, with full confidence that the results would give her grounds to put a definitive end to the engagement. She was looking for debt, for scandal, for something she could bring to Nicholas like a receipt. What the investigator brought back was not what she ordered. The report was 41 pages long. It covered the company holdings, the trust structure, the asset valuation, the historical ownership records. All of it documented, all of it clean, all of it pointing to a single, unavoidable conclusion. The woman in the second-hand blue dress was by every financial measure in a different category than anyone at that dinner table had imagined. Not just comfortable, not just secure, generationally, significantly wealthy. I imagine the phone call between Victoria and her investigator was a quiet one. I imagine she read the report more than once. I imagine she sat alone with it for a while. She called an emergency family meeting. Nicholas told me about it afterward. The cousins were summoned. The aunt came. The lawyer was there with his notepad open and then closed again very quickly once the documents were passed around the table. The room, from what Nicholas described, went through several distinct phases: disbelief, recalculation, and a very particular silence that follows a moment when a group of people realizes, collectively, that they have made a serious error. And then I walked in. Nicholas had asked me to come. I want to be honest, part of me didn't want to. Part of me wanted to let the silence sit, let them live in it for a while. But I thought about my father and what he would have done, and I put on a plain gray dress, took my lawyer with me, and walked through that door with the same face I'd worn to the first dinner. Calm, unhurried, unimpressed. The room was different this time. The cousins were quiet in a new way, not the whispering kind of quiet, but the still kind. The aunt who mentioned her designer dress twice did not mention it today.
The lawyer nodded at my lawyer with a respect he had not extended to me before, and Victoria sat at the head of the table exactly where she had sat the first time, but something about her posture had shifted. The certainty was gone. I sat down, I looked around the room, and then I said, simply, that I had come to talk about the wedding dates. The line landed exactly the way I intended it to. Not as a threat, not a victory lap, just as a statement of calm authority from a woman who had nothing to prove and knew it. Victoria asked to speak with me privately after the meeting. We stepped into a smaller room, just the two of us. She was composed, but I could see the effort it was taking. She told me she had misjudged the situation. She told me she hoped we could start again. She extended her hand. I looked at her hand, and then I looked at her face, and I said something I had been thinking about since that first dinner. I told her that I didn't need her approval then, and I didn't need her apology now, but that I was willing to build something new if she was willing to be honest about why the old thing had been so wrong. Not an apology for what I turned out to be worth, an apology for treating another human being like a problem to be solved before she'd even been given a chance to speak. She held my gaze, and for the first time, Victoria looked less like a gatekeeper and more like a woman who had spent so long protecting something that she had forgotten what she was actually protecting it for. She said she understood. I believe she meant it. I want to tell you something honest. In the weeks between that dinner and the family meeting, I almost left. Not almost in the casual sense. I actually packed a bag one evening, sat on the edge of my bed, and thought seriously about walking away from it all. From Nicholas, from the family, from the entire situation that had somehow turned my life into something I didn't recognize. What stopped me wasn't love alone. Love by itself is not always enough reason to stay in something hard. What stopped me was a moment that happened 3 weeks after I showed Nicholas the documents. We were at a family gathering, not the crisis meeting, an earlier one, smaller, and someone made a comment. Nothing dramatic, just a casual remark from one of the cousins, implying that perhaps the engagement had moved too fast. Nicholas put down his glass. He turned to his cousin, and in front of everyone there, he said clearly and without hesitation that I was the most genuinely good person he had ever met, that he had failed to show that properly at the start, and that it would not happen again. Then he picked his glass back up and changed the subject. It was not a grand speech. It wasn't meant to be. But it was public, and it was unsolicited, and it was exactly what that first dinner had stolen from me. It was the moment I decided to stay. The wedding was held on a Saturday in late spring at my family's farm, the same land my father had loved, with the same light that came through the trees in the early morning that I had grown up watching. I wore a dress my mother made, just like the first one, but white this time. Nicholas wore a simple suit. There were no chandeliers. There was no catering company with a Michelin star. There were long tables outside, food made by people who loved us, and music that went on past midnight. Victoria came, and I noticed, without saying anything about it, that she had chosen to wear a simple dress. No statement jewelry, nothing that called attention to itself. I don't know if it was deliberate or unconscious, but it struck me as something. A small gesture from a woman who was, in her own private way, beginning to understand something new. People ask me sometimes whether I feel like I won, and I always tell them the same thing. Winning was never the point. The point was never to be right. The point was never to watch people scramble when the truth arrived. The point, the only point that ever mattered, was to be seen clearly, not for what I had, but for who I was. My father used to say something when I was young and came home hurt by something a classmate had said, or a teacher had implied, or a neighbor had assumed. He would sit down, look me in the eyes, and say this: "Never let anyone's opinion of you become your reality, not because their opinion doesn't sting, it does, but because your reality is built by you, and it is stronger than their words, and it will outlast every room that ever tried to make you feel small." I think about that every time I walk into a room now. I think about the woman I was at that first dinner, sitting quietly, touching an envelope she didn't need to open, choosing grace over proof. And I think she was already everything she needed to be before anyone else in that room figured it out.
If this story stayed with you, if you felt something during that dinner scene, during the moment she touched the envelope and decided to wait, during that quiet apology from a man who finally understood what he had done, then please share this with someone who needs to hear it today. The person who's been told they're not enough, the person sitting at a table right now surrounded by people who have already made up their minds, the person carrying something heavy and quiet because they refuse to prove themselves to people who haven't earned the truth. Comment below and tell me, have you ever been in that room? Have you ever been the person in the second-hand dress? Because this community sees you. Like this video, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.